Okay, so if we make a start, so I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to dial in. This obviously is the first of a series of PIN webinars that we'll be undertaking over the coming weeks. So I hope you can join us for the others. But the focus of today's is on the future of innovation in a post-COVID world. Just briefly before we kick in and get into the main event, very briefly, for those people that aren't familiar with the Productivity Insights Network, my name's Tim Vorley and I'm one of the co-directors of the Productivity Insights Network. It feels a long time ago now, but we were established back in January 2018 to try and bring a kind of a broader multidisciplinary social science perspective to research on productivity. And over the last 2 and a bit years now, we've actively tried to fund and support projects in a range of areas, as well as trying to encourage and stimulate debate and thinking around productivity in theory and practice with a range of organizations. So today really kind of marks a kind of a slightly new era where, as a result of not being able to host our annual conference physically earlier in the year due to the pandemic, we've tried to take more of an online approach. And this really is kind of testament to the success and the feedback of that. For those that are interested, the availability of that conference you can download and you can look at online, and there are live recordings of it. So I'd certainly encourage you to do that. We had some great speakers there, as we have got today as well. Before I kind of hand over to the speakers and introduce them, just to flag one of the next webinars that we've got coming up. So Ian Doherty from Stirling and Tom Forth from the ODI in Leeds are going to be hosting a webinar looking at transport, the economy and sustainability post-COVID, and that's on the 18th of June, so it'll be the same time, 12 o'clock. So in terms of today, we've got 4 speakers, many of whom are kind of familiar with and well-known friends of the Productivity Insights Network. So we've got Steve Roper from the ERC and University of Warwick, Jonathan Cook from SQW and a co-I on the Productivity Insights Network, Jen Ray from Nesta, and Jen is on the advisory board of the Productivity Insights Network, and another co-I, Rob Huggins at the University of Cardiff University, sorry, who is additionally a co-I on the project. I'm going to hand over to Steve and I will introduce our discussant after we've heard from all of the presenters. In hosting this today, obviously there is a Q&A chat function, and I'd encourage people to both contribute to that with questions that they may have that could relate to the different discussions and the pieces that we're going to hear from the speakers, and also vote and upvote them if you have particular questions that you think of interest and that you would like to have addressed. And if you could also highlight who that question should be directed at, then I will try and share that later. But without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Steve, if that's okay.
Good. Hopefully you can all see that now. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Tim was saying, my name's Stephen Roper. I'm based at Warwick Business School. And I want to spend a few minutes looking back to see what we might learn about innovation going forward from the experience after the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. So I guess the key question here is, well, what's going to happen in the future? But I guess a bit of care is necessary in terms of looking back and drawing very direct lessons. There are some parallels, though, I think, between the great financial crisis of 2008-10 and the current crisis, which are quite interesting. Both were very sharp, exogenous, unexpected shocks to firms and to economies. Both have had this effect, or will have this effect, of sharply reducing liquidity in those firms which survived. The financial crisis, of course, through limited bank lending post-crisis. The current crisis through the effects of shutdown and lockdown, and the fact that firms are clearly not generating revenue at the moment, and that's impacting very severely on balance sheets. So we'll cover 3 questions briefly. I'll look at what happened to the extent and breadth of innovation in the UK after the global financial crisis, what happened to the intensity of innovative activity, and what happened a little bit in some of the other OECD countries. and I'll finish with a few speculative comments about the future. And I will try and do this all in 10 minutes, or 9 minutes from now, I guess. This is data from the UK Innovation Survey, looking at the various waves of the survey. You see here the different waves along the bottom, and three indicators of the proportion of firms across the UK with 10 plus employees who were innovating at various points in time in different ways. And I've indexed each of these time series at 100 in 2008-10, so we can see changes relative to the recession period of 2008-2010, which actually coincided with one of the survey waves. So if you follow the blue line here, what you see is the proportion of innovative active firms, which is a broad definition of a range of innovation activities, fell 60% to the recession period. The other two indicators, process and product innovators, fell around a third. So what we have as we moved into the 2008-10 recession period was that the proportion of firms across the economy that were engaged in innovation dropped by between a third and 50 or 60%. And that has recovered very, very slowly in subsequent waves of the survey. It took until 2012, 2014 for the proportion of innovation active firms to recover, and similar sort of time for the proportion of firms with product and service and process innovation to recover. What do I take from this? Well, the recovery from the global financial crisis in terms of the proportion of innovative firms, for those firms undertaking innovation, the spread of innovation across the population of firms, recovered really slowly. And if there's a lesson here, it's probably that recovery, the proportion of innovating firms post-COVID, it's also going to recover fairly slowly. Now let's move on to have a quick look at the intensity of innovative activity. This is OECD data from 2008 to 2016 on the volume of business R&D spending in UK sectors over that period. So I'm taking a single indicator here, which is the volume of business R&D spending, the real value of business R&D spending in each sector. Again, I've indexed it at 2008 as the base year. Values in red to the right-hand side of this slide indicate levels which were of R&D spend, which were actually lower than the recessionary level. Green indicators, green cells are where the levels have recovered. So if you look across the top chart here, this is total business R&D spend. It fell slightly from 2008 to 2009 and 2010, and then has recovered consistently through to 2016. The interesting thing here is, as you look down the individual sectors, what you see is that a range of, the agriculture, a range of more traditional manufacturing sectors, and then one or two very significant service sectors, information and communications and financial insurance activities, never got back to their level of R&D spend from the recessionary period. So we have this very uneven pattern of recovery across different sectors in the UK, which has been produced by the UK innovation system. Other countries manage more consistency, for good or bad, in terms of balanced outcomes. In South Korea, it's all green, so every sector managed to bounce back pretty quickly from the recession into the previous period. There were one or two red cells, but not too many. A few sectors in manufacturing took a little bit of time to respond. Spain looks completely the opposite, of course, that levels of R&D spend in aggregate in Spain fell quite sharply post the recession, and most sectors in Spain still have levels of research and development spend that are way, way below what they were in 2008 in the recessionary period. Sorry, let's go back here. And if one reason for this sectoral trend is, of course, the aggregate trend in R&D in different countries. So here's Korea. It's grown R&D spend in Korea has grown 73% over the post gross financial crisis period, 2008 to 2015, and that's dragged all sectors up with it. So it's been a very balanced sort of progress that they've made. Here's the UK, 23% up, Germany 21%, Here's Spain, where aggregate R&D actually fell. So one reason that's driving these sectoral changes, sectoral contrasts between countries, is this change in aggregate R&D spend. But even where countries, and so this is now a slightly different chart, the proportion of sectors on the vertical axis here, which have levels of spend above their, levels of R&D spend above their recessionary level. So you see it's nearly 100% for Korea, it's all green, it's all red for Spain pretty well, so they have a very low proportion. The comparison between the UK and Germany is interesting here. In the UK, we still have, even in 2016, around a third of our sectors which have R&D levels below that in 2008. In Germany, it's just about 1 in 10. So despite very similar levels of increase in aggregate spend over the 2008-2016 period, Germany's managed to achieve a much more balanced outcome than the firms, than sectors in the UK. So we have this, we seem to have an ecosystem in the UK which generates these rather diverse sectoral experiences post-crisis. And again, I guess there's some suggestions about what we might see post-COVID. So let me finish with just some rather speculative remarks. Recovery seems likely to be slow and very uneven, and I could have told you a similar story to the sectoral story by region. If the same pattern repeats post-COVID as it did pre-COVID, after the great financial crisis, the northeast and northwest and other northern regions, perhaps Yorkshire and Humberside, look likely to be worst hit, along with foundation industries and agriculture. And there's some ambiguity about what will happen in services. We might ask why we have this UK ecosystem which produces these unbalanced or more uneven outcomes. And I think there are a number of reasons, but let me talk briefly about two. One is that we have no counterbalances within the UK system. It's very centralized. Germany and Belgium, which managed to produce more balanced outcomes, do have these kind of regional and national levels of governance in the innovation system. And that balance, I think, probably is one of the factors which is leading to more balanced recoveries. And UK policy since 2012-13 has also targeted specifically unbalanced outcomes, focusing support on a number of key sectors. Now that might be the right thing, or it might be the wrong thing to do, but it does raise questions, I think, about whether we need to support a broader innovation ecosystem during this kind of period of recovery. So more on the ERC website, and I will probably stop there.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Steve. I think obviously it raises a lot of questions that I'm sure that will get picked up later, particularly regarding the geography and the levelling up agenda, something that's been kind of very core to what PIN's been interested in. Steve, could I ask you to stop sharing your slides if you can? And I'm going to hand over to Johnny. Do feel free, just everyone, to add into the questions if you have anything as they go, so you don't have to kind of collate them at the end, and we'll coordinate and people can vote on the questions as we go through. Okay, Johnny, over to you.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much, Steve, for that informative presentation. So I'm going to take a slightly different focus now and have a look at how the pandemic may affect the innovation landscape and how innovation policy may play a role in responding in terms of supporting recovery and also importantly supporting economic and societal resilience in the future. So I'm going to just start off by talking through a few contextual issues, both from the literature and from policy frameworks as they currently stand or stood certainly before the pandemic. So some key points to note, I think, from over the last sort of 30 to 40 years, it's become increasingly clear of the role of knowledge and innovation and the creation and the use of that knowledge in terms of supporting productivity and economic growth. And two key things I wanted to highlight: the role of networks and collaboration so that organizations can access knowledge outside of their own organizations and use that to support their competitiveness. And as part of that, the increasing recognition of the role of geographic clustering that can often support those networks, although not exclusively, but that has been quite an important aspect in developing ecosystems. The second area then around diffusion and the role of absorptive capacity within organizations in order to be able to access and use the knowledge from outside. And what we have seen from some of the evidence is that some of the different differentials between regions, between sectors, and between firms can explain some of the differentials in performance, because there are differences in terms of how those geographic clusters are operating, or there are differences in the capabilities of different firms and sectors to be able to absorb knowledge from the outside. So that's in terms of some of the literature. In terms of the policy frameworks, industrial strategy has recognised this importance of the regional differentials through place, but also two other important aspects. The key objective for increasing R&D investment in the UK recognised as being a relative weakness compared to other nations, and this idea of the challenge orientation, which has provided some focus to focus on those areas where there are economic opportunities, but also an opportunity to respond to societal challenges. So from those contextual issues, there are 4 potential new drivers or changes to those issues that I wanted to talk through. So changes in models of collaboration that might be brought about as a result of the pandemic, the needs for businesses to adapt and to become more resilient, constraints on R&D and innovation activity, which we'll pick up on a couple of key areas following Steve's presentation, and the potential move or changes in terms of a mission-based focus for policy. So first then, on business adaptation. So we've seen certainly in the short term how businesses have had to adapt their working practices, their working models, and they've also had to adapt in terms of thinking about how to change their business model in terms of trying to find different ways of serving their customers, pivoting into new markets, or considering how they may pivot as they move towards some kind of restarting of their businesses. Now, these short-term necessity to adapt could actually lead to some longer-term shifts. So as organizations have become more confident in the role, for instance, of technology in supporting changes in working practices, that could lead to some longer-term shifts in terms of how they think about investing in technology in order to support working practices and changes in their practices. And similarly, we may see some longer-term shifts in terms of how businesses think about responding to their markets and their changing markets. And there's some drivers here, drawing on some recent work in the States, what these enduring drivers might be and how those may contribute to some of the longer term shifts around things like remote interaction, how goods are distributed, drivers around resilience. So whilst there may be some appetite for these longer term shifts, there are some issues that will need to be addressed. And there's 2 particularly to highlight. There's the capabilities of organizations in order to be able to adapt in the longer term through having the right management skills, having the right management practices. And these are some of the things that have been recognized as being relative weaknesses in the UK and areas where there is likely to be a need for some support for organizations in order to be able to capitalize on these changes. And then secondly, almost a sort of a paradox that in order to bring about these changes, there's going to be a need for some form of investment in order to do that. And it may be actually that whilst there's an appetite for companies to change, the ability to actually invest in those things may be difficult given the restrictions on cash reserves and also restrictions on being able to access finance from outside. So in terms of policy, then there's this kind of imperative to think about sort of expanding the role of innovation policy so that it becomes more focused on supporting adoption of new technology and new ideas in order to help firms to respond so that they, in terms of the post-crisis world, they have higher productivity and higher resilience. Just moving on then to R&D and innovation activity. I won't dwell too much on the pro-cyclical nature of activity as covered just now by Steve, but there are two things I just wanted to highlight in terms of where businesses may seek funding for their R&D activity. So in terms of equity investment, it's likely that we'll see declines in the availability of equity investment. And this is likely based on the experience post the financial crisis to really hit hard some of the earlier stage and deep technology companies that we may expect to be amongst the most R&D intensive companies, which could cause some acute gaps for companies of that nature. And secondly, we're likely to see some increased demand for public funding, and I think Innovate UK has already started to see this in terms of the applications for its grant funding. And so there are questions about what the role is of public funding and how it steps into what might be a revised finance escalator for funding of R&D and innovation activity. And so in terms of policy then, it's kind of, there's a need to really identify and address those areas of acute funding gaps, which will be critical and which could be linked into some of the challenge and place-based priorities. Moving on to the third area, changes to collaboration models. We've seen in the short term some positive responses to the crisis through remote approaches and new collaborations, and those reflect some of the short-term constraints and opportunities. So constraints in being able to undertake R&D activity yourselves often can lead to collaboration as you look to share risk. And also the opportunities that have been stimulated as a result of the pandemic can lead to new collaborations as well. The other area, which I suspect Rob will talk a little bit more about a bit later, is the potential changes in emphasis on proximity. So I talked earlier about the role of geographic clustering. And whilst that may still be important in the future, the extent to which there's an emphasis on proximity to support collaboration, we may expect to change as patterns shift towards more remote approaches to collaboration, as city-based innovation districts there may be a slight shift in emphasis to sort of edge of city as a result of response to the pandemic. So the implication here then for policy is to really understand these changes in collaboration models and to look at ways in which they can be facilitated through networking, through incentives, and through supporting more remote models. So then finally, brings us on to innovation policy around missions, and we've picked out here some of the changes that we may expect to see in terms of societal priorities around health and well-being, climate, and security and resilience. And there are some clear roles here for innovation policy to support such societal priorities in terms of the technologies, but importantly, I think in terms of thinking about the innovation policy in a wider context. So how different communities are brought together in order to ensure that technologies are adopted, in order to ensure that there's diffusion and adoption both in the business space and within wider society of those technologies, and actually in terms of thinking about how innovation may support the development of sovereign capabilities, which is often an area for the defence world, but may be increasingly important in terms of areas around things like health, energy, food, and so on. So the policy implication here is how these societal priorities may guide the focus of policy, which then needs to link together not just the development of technologies, but linking together research, development, adoption, and capability development. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Johnny. That's I can see we're getting a number of kind of questions coming in as well, and some of these relating to both Steve and Jonathan's talk there. So if we'll try and group these together, but please, if you see a question that you particularly want, if we do get towards the end of the presentations and we have limited time, I'll try and focus on those that have got the kind of the most thumbs up, so to speak. So I'm going to hand over to Jen, if that's okay, and if you want to share your screen.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thank you to the Productivity Insights Network for having me to speak today on such an important topic. I just had a flick through to see who was on the webinar, and there's loads of familiar names, so it's great to talk to you all. I think that, so I'm also going to focus my presentation on the implications for innovation policy, and I hope ask some challenging questions about the future direction of it. I think in terms of understanding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're still at the very early stages of knowing what's happening right now, but also what might happen in the future. But we know that some parts of the country will be more affected than others, some sectors, and also some groups in society. And we knew that the economy wasn't working for some people even before we went into this period. And I think there's an opportunity here in the midst of a lot of uncertainty and suffering to look for the lasting change that might come out of it. But I appreciate it's still an early stage look at it. I would like to talk in my presentation about the kind of wider implications for innovation policy. And I wanted to talk in 3 areas and then do a quick what might happen next, or what could we do. So the first area I'm going to focus on is where should innovation policy focus, and I mean geographically across the UK with that one. Then I want to talk a little bit about what it should focus on, and then also who's benefiting from innovation and from the policy that we set out as a country. So the first area on geography, I'm going to draw on some recent work that we published at Nesta earlier on in the week. It's by 2 authors who I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, Richard Jones and Tom Forth. So it's called The Missing 4 Billion, and I'll explain why in a minute. But they argue that R&D, policy to support R&D, and R&D specifically, we've not been getting it right for quite some time. And I think that both Johnny and Steve touched on this too. So we're an outlier in the UK in terms of how much we spend on R&D. And we're also an outlier in terms of where it goes in the country. And so they're making the argument in this research that there's an opportunity to think differently about how we prioritise particularly public money on R&D and its relationship with business investment as well. So one of the main arguments that they make is that previously the intervention level has just been too small. So this is where the missing 4 billion figure comes in. So they calculated that in order to, and let's go for level up the UK, that we would need to spend an extra 4 billion in different ways across the country. So this is based on the average of what's spent in London and the southeast. And you can see that bits of the country would get considerably more if you did it this way. They also calculated how much was spent on innovation in the RDA network during 2005-2008, which is, as you can see, is not at the same level. So they're arguing that there's an opportunity to do this differently. But I think what's clear is that you wouldn't necessarily spend it this way. And how you decide how to spend it is a series of trade-offs. So this is a GIF for you that shows some of those trade-offs. So this is a tool that we've got on the Nesta website that you can play around with. But essentially, the different types of decisions you might make about where R&D goes are based on what you think the purpose of both innovation and the economy should be. So you can see that some of those trade-offs are in the table on the right. So whether you'd spend equally everywhere, whether you'd spend where the research base is strongest, where businesses spend, or where the economy is weakest, where GPA is low, or where you think manufacturing is strongest. And I think from this, well, I'm not proposing to answer this question now, but these trade-offs become more and more stark, I think, as we work out what we do with limited public funding and what the purpose of it would be. what we want to achieve with it. So the second area that I wanted to highlight was what it should focus on, or what types of activity we want to support with innovation policy. And I'm not going to dwell on this one because I think that both Steve and Johnny covered it well. But essentially, I think this is a point around where jobs are created in the economy, particularly in the foundational industries. And we know that those are some of the industries that are going to really feel the sharp end of the recession that comes from after the pandemic. So it's going to be even more important to focus our attentions on innovation diffusion and also moving beyond a definition of innovation policy that's about high tech and high growth. So the third area that I wanted to highlight is who benefits from innovation policy and the purpose of it. From this, I wanted just to briefly point out some stats from some public perceptions work that I commissioned last year. So it was done in November before the general election. And we were keen to get an idea of how the public view innovation and the purpose of it and who benefits from it. The good thing about it was that people are quite positive about it. They knew what it was, they could define it. But there was a strong sense from that research that people like them don't benefit. We also asked a series of trade-off questions, which are in the middle of this slide. And it was pretty stark what people were willing to trade off. So I was particularly interested in the middle one around investing in places in the country, or innovation should be focused on making everywhere in the country more prosperous, even if some areas would get better, slower progress in some areas. And I think this is a really interesting finding when you think about the role of innovation policy and how it is being used in the past. And I think there's an opportunity to, as part of moving forward and thinking about government policy, to really start to shape innovation policy, to start to think about whose problems are we solving here, and how do we incorporate a greater sense of benefit from innovation. I had a quick slide with some things that I think we should be discussing for innovation policy and how we might get there. These might be picked up in Q&A and discussion, but I wanted to give them to you. I think we do need to look at what recovery looks like for different parts of the country and cities and regions. I think we have made some moves as a country in trying to link both innovation and the jobs it creates with the skills that are needed, but I think we're going to have to do a lot more on that. And I also think it's time to start looking at how we can devolve more power, responsibility, and crucially budgets to cities to allow them to support their innovative businesses and their innovation capability. It may not be right for everywhere, but I think there's certainly places now who could look at it. I think we can look at new R&D institutions, particularly outside London and the Southeast, and look at the role of innovation districts and test beds. I think for the foundational economy, that it's about spreading innovation beyond the high-tech frontier and looking at diffusion. The Business Basics Fund that I know that many of you will have been involved in is a start on that, this experimentation to learn what works and then scale up those interventions. I think it's going to be very important because we do have the evidence base is light here. And then finally, I think that there's a chance to proactively guide innovation policy and to start to think about whose problems we're solving with it. Missions are a start on that approach, but I think that we could go further in the new government policy. So I'm going to stop there. I think that's the end of my slides, and I look forward to picking up your questions.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Jen. So if you don't mind unsharing, that's great. So I'm going to hand over to Rob Huggins now. And I think that some of the themes that are kind of highlighted by Jen there, particularly thinking about the kind of the geography again, innovation districts and the kind of scale at which we interact with the challenge are going to be picked up by Rob. So Rob, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. As was sort of touched upon earlier, I'm going to look at the role of cities in the changing innovation environment. I'm going to sort of ask the question, is the danger, perceived or apparent, of being near people is actually going to make things different in terms of the economics of innovation? And to give you the answer, I think it's yes, I think it is changing. But I think it's been changing over time, and I want to try and convince you of some of those issues. Just to start off, I don't know whether some of you may have seen this book. It's quite a good book come out from the political scientist Hilton Root, and he's argued about the forces of globalization and about the more density in terms of interactions, in terms of trade and various other aspects. And there's a quote in the introduction. He said about this multipolar world is emerging, and that vulnerability is at any corner in a way in terms of unexpected shocks. I don't think he was thinking about COVID at that point in time, but that's the way he's sort of the argument is going. And he's pushing for the fact that there is more globalization, more connectivity between the East and West in terms of both competition and collaboration as well. And obviously he put that out before COVID. Of course, if you look at some of the press now, there is this argument that's sort of about deglobalization. The era of peak globalization is over, so there's going to be more. There's going to be a push more towards localization, and I guess maybe the issues around trade wars or less global trade, which again, you know, there's a strong rhetoric there, but it'll be interesting to see how that pans out over the future. And then the other argument seems to be within the press, or at least online, is that, as was touched upon earlier, is that maybe not the end of cities, but a change in role of cities, and that there will be some hollowing out of cities, particularly maybe for innovation around technology, as people, again, there's sort of the fear of being within the city. Not quite apparent where people will go or where activity will take place, but then again, this is another sort of argument. I think this was just a blog came out from a week or so ago from some people at Wharton. So they've sort of said post-COVID-19 world will be less global and less urban. So they're all been bringing together these two sort of forces, sort of dispersion in terms of away from the urban, and again, less connectivity. So how does that fit in terms of what we're trying to do with PIN? Well, some of the work we've been doing with the productivity project, coupled with obviously work with Steve as well, is the role of innovation in driving productivity. And a lot of the argument, particularly the work that I've done, and again others has argued about the need for proximity and connectivity between innovation actors. And I think this builds on a sort of an urban theory literature coming from people like Richard Florida in the past, Ed Glazer, who really sort of championed the role of the city in pushing forward innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic development as a whole. And there's a nice new book from Sharon Zukin, which I recommend, the Innovation Complex, where she's looked particularly at New York and the way that's changed to become more of a hub in terms of innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship over time. And again, so all sort of arguing about the role of proximity and the importance of cities in this activity. I guess prior even to COVID, there's already been a sort of a counter argument in terms of cities, and Florida to some extent maybe has changed his mind. He's talked about new urban crisis, where he's focused on the issue of negative externalities in terms of costs, and some of the more negative roles around cities in terms of inequality that may be pushing people out from cities, especially large cities, I guess, as well. But it's not totally new in terms of the argument coming out from from COVID. But if we look at some of the data in terms of where people are and where innovation takes place, there's a strong correlation. This sort of maps the idea of where there's a density of people, or where there's a density of innovation, and there's a very strong match, and there has been over time. So where people tend to be, there tends to be where the most innovation takes place. So is there going to be some large change in terms of away from this correlation between innovation and urban density? And there's a nice new book, I don't know whether some people have come across this book, Loon Shots from Safi Bakal, and he's looking at radical innovation. And he says many radical innovations at the outside just seen as being mad, just being seen as being mental in a way. They would never actually happen. But due to the fact that these ideas have sprung out around large centers of people working together, could be geographically in certain places or within large organizations. Those have actually gained traction. And these ideas, which seem to be wild, have actually been the ones that have been the radical innovations over time. So he sort of argues that you need this density. Large groups of people are needed actually to translate these ideas into new technologies, you know. And so again, we're seeing something in terms of this argument around the density approach. And if we think about this, there's lots of rankings available in terms of thinking about which cities are the most innovative. I quite like this one from Startup Blink. I think this data only came out last week. They've just published their latest rankings. It's not necessarily innovation, it's more around entrepreneurship. This is their top 25 cities around the world in terms of entrepreneurship. I think there'd be a strong correlation. We've got San Francisco, New York, London, Boston, and it's the ones probably we would expect. And again, we can see this link between size and also innovation and entrepreneurship capacity. And I've done some work with my colleague, Piers Thompson. We've done an analysis of Peter Hall's Cities in Civilization, which he published just over 20 years ago now. Massive book, over 1,000 pages, where he looks at different case studies of particular cities in terms of their innovation capacity. It goes all the way back to Rome, and then looking at sort of Silicon Valley, etc. And we've done some content analysis, and what we can see is within each city, there's normally around about 20 different innovation agents who've sort of led the change. Not necessarily always at the same point in time, but there's been more of an evolutionary sort of development. And these have always tended to be cited, located within cities. So where we've seen big innovations, those big innovations tend to be associated with particular cities over time. And again, if we look what's happening today, if we look at some of the press, Jen mentioned around innovation districts. Brookings are doing work at the moment showing that actually innovation districts within cities playing a key role in terms of COVID. And are we going to see this distribution away from people, innovators away from cities? And there was a piece, I think it was in The Guardian, around tech entrepreneurs within the city. And they're saying they want their workers back. They're not going to allow their people actually to work at home, or maybe work at home as much as they'd like to. They want them back in the office because they can understand the value of the face-to-face interaction. So maybe there's push and pulls with regard to some of these geographic changes. And this is quite a nice chart, again from Startup Blink. They've actually looked at in terms of where COVID innovation is taking place around the world. Again, this is the top 30. If you look at it, there's a strong correlation between where the COVID research is undertaken and the leading cities around the world, which are already the most innovative. So again, maybe even with regard to that sort of innovation, we're not seeing as much dispersion. So what I think we're going to see, we are going to see some distribution in terms of innovation, and that's going to happen. But we're going to see again this sort of hub and spoke in terms of hub cities and those are satellites which are connected to these hubs. And so from my own research, we sort of begin to see this. Because again, there's this tension between sort of the negative externalities and the more positive in terms of agglomeration and the need to search for new ideas in cities. And of course, these will change, these hubs and cities. If you think of hub cities today, San Francisco, London, for instance, they probably were more like satellites 20 to 30 years ago. And we're going to see this sort of change in this sort of morphology over time. Just some other trends, and I haven't got that much time left, but just to sort of think about some of the other changes that are happening. Investment in innovation, well, Steve touched upon this. Innovation is becoming very expensive. And a lot of it is around the investment needed in networks in terms of connectivity. And we can see these new sort of actors emerging out in these ecosystems. Innovation scouts trying to connect people. Innovation theatre, events to sort of sell out new ideas. Experimental entrepreneurship. Those people who are sort of touting new ideas, they're not really fully fledged in terms of entrepreneurs, but they're seeking to connect with businesses who can maybe help them commercialize some of these ideas, which is why we see this rapid growth in terms of systems within some of the big cities. And I think all cities are going to need these ecosystems in terms of co-working spaces, incubators, acceleration, etc. And this is all connected to the notion around open innovation. But the research I've been doing, when you start looking at some of these projects, is high levels of failure with regards to some of these open innovation projects. They're very skeptical. They're very risky. And often really it's a different process in terms of the way that the traditional R&D organizations are again attempting to outsource a lot of their activity around innovation to smaller entrepreneurs. So there's sort of shifting burden in terms of the risk of innovation from the larger players to the smaller players. And again, that was coming from my own research, but I've just reading Henry Chesborough's, the godfather of open innovation, his new book, just been published now by Oxford, Open Innovation Results. And he's quite open, really, of saying, in a way, that open innovation itself hasn't quite created the results he would expect. And really, it's been an excuse for many of these businesses to actually, again, shift this burden in terms of investment in innovation over time. I'd be interested, again, to see how that pans out in coming years. And the other one is obviously, in terms of open innovation, is this thinking about whether we can, and we particularly with us within PIN, of whether we can see productivity and efficiency. But it's clear to me that innovation is never an efficient system in a way. It requires so much investment on a number of levels in terms of around finance, development of networks. The whole process tends to be very inefficient. But as I said on the last sort of slide there, nevertheless, the few in terms of make up for the many. So we see failure from many different projects, but of course it's having those big winners over time. And cities themselves are sort of inefficient in terms of the way that they promote.
Rob, if you're okay, I might ask you just to draw to a close on this slide,
yeah,
so we can get it done.
Run out. So what I'm basically arguing is what Jacobs has argued over time, what she argued almost 50 years ago, is that cities are inefficient in the way that they operate. For innovation itself is an inefficient undertaking. So we need to factor that in terms of how we think about developing new models of innovation for the future, and the fact that still there's going to be a big attraction to cities over time.
Fantastic, thanks, Rob, and
okay?
sorry for cutting across.
Okay, there's a lot of slides.
So we've got about 10-15 minutes left, and we have some questions coming in, and I can see that some of the panel have already started to kind of identify who's going to answer them. But I'm going to hand over to Dan Hodges from UKRI now, who is going to kind of provide some, I think, reflections and some thought of his own on those presentations. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I'll try and be reasonably brief so we can get through some of the questions from the audience as well. Thank you, everyone, for really thought-provoking perspectives there. Really enjoyed that. I'll quickly go through each just with some key reflections. Steve, really interesting learnings from the great financial crisis well, around about 10 years ago. I also think some key differences we're seeing this time, which might make things a little bit different. Back in 2010, we saw government expenditure on R&D falling, or certainly nearly falling, particularly from 2010-11 when austerity policies hit in. Whereas this time things are looking quite different. There's more proactive support happening already to directly counter the impact of COVID-19 on the innovation community. And also this has happened during a time that government was already committing to very substantial increases in science and innovation support over the next several years as we strive to reach 2.4% R&D intensity for the UK. So it's quite a different context we could see if those commitments do bear out over the next few years. And there's also thinking about the differences we saw in the regional implications after the financial crisis. We now have a very strong emphasis, and I mean, in some ways we've often had a very strong emphasis on this, but I think particularly so at the moment, a commitment to levelling up the regions from the current administration. Now it's early days and we'll need to see what that actually looks like in practice. In UKRI, we've seen the Strength in Places Fund introduced over the last 2 years, which directly looks to tackle this. Lots of positives around that fund, I think. I know there's some criticisms that could be levelled at it as well. And then in terms of sectoral differences, I know Innovate UK take a much more proactive position around services than we would have done 10 years ago. So hopefully those things can combine to improve some of the outcomes we're seeing across those different groups. Johnny, I thought some really interesting points raised about the implications for innovation policy. You mentioned potentially expanding the role of policy to focus more on supporting the adoption of new tech and adaptive practices, to identify and address areas of acute funding gaps, and looking at geographical clustering, but perhaps with proximity becoming less important. We've heard a lot more about that from Rob just now. For me, I think there's actually a really important role for the social sciences in helping inform policy and how we get out of this crisis in the best possible way, not just in terms of the wider thinking about the effects of the pandemic on society or mental health and things like that, but looking at how businesses can adapt, and business model innovation as well, which has been, for me, a long-standing area of interest, and Tim and I worked on projects on that for many years. I think it's really important generally. I think it will continue to be really important. You talked a bit about equity flows, and we can expect that to decrease. We have been keeping an eye on what's happening in equity investment. Nothing really jumping out very strongly yet, but it is all happening in a context over the last several years of a decreasing number of larger deals. And it'll be interesting to see whether that continues or whether there's any changes that we see as we go through the crisis we're currently in. Jen, I mean, I try to resist focusing too much on place, but I'm also very much going to in this case. So I think a really interesting report came out around the missing 4 billion. I think there's a huge amount of complexity in the data here, and a lot to consider behind the surface. So which programs are funding which geographical regions, what local agencies are doing in the devolved administrations. We get a lot of support from InvestNI, for example, which naturally decreases the demand you see for support from the UK-wide schemes. London spending figures, as they show up, are highly skewed because of the headquartering effect that we see, that we haven't yet managed to nullify in our own spend data, although we're looking at how we can better do that. We've done some interesting work looking at expenditure per innovative business rather than per person. It provides a very different picture with less of a skew to London, and we need to understand what's driving that. Which isn't to say there isn't an issue here, but I think it's a lot more complicated than it can appear on the surface, and UKRI are putting a lot of effort into understanding that at the moment. I thought it was a good point in the Q&A from Alan Hughes about thinking not just about where the spend happens, but where the impact of that spend materialises, which can, again, be quite a different picture. And then finally, Rob, some really interesting stuff there. I've noted down a couple of things I want to go away and read that I haven't yet read, so thank you for that. Talked about is in the context of tech companies and the value of those face-to-face interactions. I think the really key thing there is not just the face-to-face interaction, but the chance encounters that will happen when you're in the same office, in the same area. And there's some really interesting literature around the importance of those chance encounters to innovations and to spurring cross-discipline or cross-sector innovations. It's something that our knowledge transfer network explicitly tries to encourage more interaction between sectors, where a solution for one problem in one sector can have a much wider application elsewhere. And on the open innovation point, interesting to see some of those counterpoints, I guess, to open innovation. And I will just promote some really interesting work by the ERC. I think it was last year, looking at when either open or closed innovation was particularly productive for different types of firms, and that an open approach wasn't always the most rational approach for companies to take. So I've rattled through a load of things there. I could have said a lot more, but I will leave it there.
No, that's great. Thanks, Dan. And so I'm going to go to the questions, and if the panel members perhaps could indicate their kind of willingness to respond. I've lost Jonathan Cook on the video, but if he reappears, just please feel free to give me a nod. There he is. So the first question that's kind of been upvoted is the perhaps nitpicking point about post-COVID terminology being misleading. I don't know if anyone has a quick response to that, but one of the things we have been looking at in a new piece of work the PIN network is doing, we actually refer to it as productivity in the pandemic. So maybe we should have titled that. But Steve, I'll hand to you.
I think this was largely a response to my terminology. I think it's very clear that we're going to go through. We have been through a period of crisis. We're going to go through a period of stabilization, hopefully, and then a period of recovery. And I think we do need to be very careful, and the policy responses will need to change quite dramatically as we go through those different phases. So post-COVID is probably a bit of a summary for both the transition and the hopeful recovery phase after that. Okay,
great. We've had a couple of questions, and I'm going to group these, but on the kind of the policy question and the geography question. And so I don't know if I'll go to perhaps Jen and Johnny on this, but with regards to the idea of missions and making them more locally relevant, and the kind of the flip side of that question from Nick Clifton about actually, not to misquote this, but rather than perhaps looking at the kind of the spending, do we need to be thinking about the concentration and actually alternative ways of looking at how we can see the benefits of this then later devised and devolved through different fiscal solutions? So Jen, do you want to pick up on that first?
Yep, great, thanks Tim. Yeah, the local making missions locally relevant, I think, is a really important question. And I think local industrial strategies were one way that the government was trying to do it. And I think that could and should be continued, but probably backed up with a bit of cash for doing the things. So I think you can make them locally relevant by saying how can this place, this city, contribute to solving the problem, and then you can also make it relevant by going, what are the problems in this area? And I think that there has to be a role for asking the public here as well, and trying to break down the barriers between what the public thinks innovation should solve, and then what the kind of national rhetoric around those missions is. So kind of linking it back up together again.
Okay, great, Johnny.
Well, so I agree with what Jenna said, but I suppose just to add to it, so missions, I think are locally relevant. So if you think about missions around things like climate and health and well-being, they're clearly relevant to residents. They're clearly relevant to local government, with different local authorities declaring climate emergencies and so on. So I think they are relevant locally. Local industrial strategies may be a way of identifying where different places are able to support solutions to respond to those societal challenges. But I think the important aspect is that all local areas have a role in implementing the solution. So this comes back to actually adopting the solutions within the business sector, but also within other organisations, and in the way in which communities actually deploy solutions to these mission-based problems.
Okay, great. I'm aware that we're coming up to the hour, so I'm going to just give everyone one last opportunity just to perhaps answer the question that was cheekily posed in there about whether productivity is now the wrong lens. But before I do that, just to pick up on the top question for Steve about the geographical implications, reference there to the kind of English regions, Invest NI, and also linking that to the point perhaps that Alan Hughes raised about the fact that co-funded research in Cambridge actually could be supporting jobs in Derby, and whether you've got any kind of observations on those 2 points.
I think jobs in Derby is a bit of a sore point at the moment, with many people in Derby but at roles, but that's a different matter. I absolutely agree with Alan that we need to look very much at this in an ecosystem-wide basis and can think about the benefits at the UK level. Do I see a quicker recovery in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales because they have regional agencies? There's certainly that potential, but it's a question about whether those agencies are doing the right thing to promote local growth, I think.
Okay, so does any, I mean, maybe I should go to Dan first. Is productivity the right or the wrong lens to continue to look at this?
So I think it is, and this actually reminded me of a point in Jen's presentation as well, where the public attitude survey asked a question around whether government should invest in innovation if it solves social problems, even if it doesn't have an economic impact. The public thought yes. It's been a long-running debate in Innovate UK. I think the important thing is that government does do that already. Innovate UK has an explicit focus on economic growth. But if you look at many other parts of government, a huge amount of spending for R&D does go into areas where the societal impact is the predominant factor and not the economic impact. And actually, I think that there's a lot of space for perhaps more coordination between UKRI and those other parts of government to ensure that those two things aren't happening in a silo, and we've got a really well joined up system that addresses both aspects.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to pick that one up from the panel? Yeah, Steve?
Bear in mind, I think Krugman's comment, you know, when he said something around productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's just about, is everything. I think we need to bear it in mind. We want to see high levels of well-being, but when you look at the local and the regional, we see such a strong correlation between high levels of well-being and levels of productivity. They go hand in hand, really, you know, and it's symbiotic, and we need to work with both, I think.
Okay, great. Steve, you were going to come in.
Only to say that I think the sort of distribute. Sorry.
Oh, Steve, we've lost you. You've gone on mute. Oh, you've unmuted. There you are. Okay.
Sorry, just to say I think the distributional aspect of this is as important as the mean level of productivity in a particular area. And I think that distributional aspect and the inequalities we've seen over the last few years have been particularly important. One thing to address for the future.
Okay, great. So I'm going to draw it to a close there. And I just want to thank all of the participants. So thanks to Stephen Roper, Robert Huggins, Jen Ray, Jonathan Cook, and Dan Hodges for taking the time for the discussion there. I apologize if we didn't get through to the questions. I've tried to kind of field our way through as many as we can, and a number were answered in the text. But I hope we can see as many of you as possible on the next webinar, and we will send out details. If you have any kind of feedback, please do let us know as well. And we'll be putting up a brief blog about this with the posting of the video as well. So thanks very much for dialing in, and I hope everyone has a good weekend and rest of the day. Thank you.